accessibility, harnessing the power of tongue swabs as supplementary specimens. Our speaker for today is Anura David, who is a medical scientist and dedicated PhD student, who has devoted her expertise to the advancement of molecular technology for tuberculosis diagnosis in resource-limited environments. With over 12 years of clinical trial management experience, she specializes in TB and HIV co-infection studies. Furthermore, Anura serves as a consultant to an international EQA provider, offering invaluable insights into TB quality control solutions, furthering advancements in diagnostic accuracy. I'll now hand over to our speaker.
Thank you, Nolwazi. I'm just pulling up my slides. Just let me know when I'm good to go.
You're good to go, Anura.
Great, thank you. Thank you to Nolwazi, and thank you to the TB think tank for allowing me this opportunity to present all the exciting work that we've been doing on tongue swabs. And as mentioned, I'm Anura David from the WITS Diagnostic Innovation Hub, and I present on behalf of a much larger consortium, which I will speak about as we move through my slides. So I thought I'd start off today's talk with this paper from Pai et al., which basically talks about transforming TB diagnosis. And basically, the authors mention 7 transitions that would help, or they think would help to close the massive gaps that we see currently in TB diagnosis. And among some of these include the move away from smear to more molecular-based testing, and the use of non-sputum specimens such as urine and oral swabs, which I'm obviously going to be speaking a little bit more about today. They also talk about moving testing closer to the communities and homes, which we saw a lot of during COVID. And again, I'm going to be speaking a little bit more about all of the work that we've been doing that encompasses a few of these different transitions that have been mentioned in this paper. So the concept of oral swabs for TB testing was first introduced in 2015 in this paper by Wood et al. And since then, there have been many other studies that have been done globally using different front ends for amplification and detection, using different types of swabs, swabbing different areas of the mouth. And basically what we see is that the sensitivity of the tongue swab for TB diagnosis ranges between about 68% to 91%. And in the systematic review paper that just was published this month, you basically see all of these, or a summary of these results being presented. So some of the issues, though, with these studies to support policy recommendation to the WHO is that these studies have been done on different populations. They have been performed using different processing methodologies, different reference standards, and different downstream testing. So I'm going to be speaking to you about a little bit about the work that we've been doing as a consortium to kind of try to standardize some of these methods that we are using. So can tongue swabs actually improve the diagnostic value chain? And here I speak of the diagnostic value chain as a component or basically links that encompass all activities that take place from the time the patient arrives at the testing facility to the time a specimen is collected, transported to the lab for testing, and the result is returned back to the healthcare provider for patient management. So how can swabs help in this process? Well, firstly, they allow an increase in access to testing since it is such an easy specimen type to collect. It reduces waiting time for the patient at the clinic. It is able to improve specimen collection, like I mentioned, and improve specimen logistics because there are less considerations for biosafety as compared to sputum. And then swabs also have the ability to increase test access both at point of care testing to centralized laboratory testing. So how do national TB programs feel about additional specimen types? You see here I speak about South Africa's experience with EPTB testing across the NHLS on the Gene Expert program. So basically, when the WHO recommended the expert assay for use in 2010, and South Africa rolled out the assay in 2011, we basically realized that EPTB specimens also needed to be tested on this assay. So it was considered off-label use, but the data was used to guide the WHO recommendations for EPTB testing in 2013 and was adopted by South Africa in 2014. So if you look at the graph on the right, you can see the number of EPTB specimens that were tested on the Gene Expert gradually increased from 2012 all the way to 2020. And additional information and data is presented in this paper by De Silva et al. And then in the table on the left, I've highlighted the CSF as a specimen type. And I wanted to just highlight that although the yield of MTB is quite low as compared to some of the other EPTB specimens, the number of CSF specimens tested is quite high because this is an accessible specimen type. And then what lessons did we learn from COVID that can also be applied to swab testing for TB? Well, during the COVID pandemic, we were tasked to evaluate a lot of the different swabs that were coming in together with the different types of transport media. And what we found during our evaluations and comparison studies is that not all swabs are equal, and the processing of these swabs actually impacts performance. And this is just some of the data that we've released from our group. And then I'd also like to mention some of the results that we analyzed during the beta wave during the COVID pandemic. And what I'd like to highlight here is that in Gauteng, we basically had access to a few different TACPAT assays, which was performed on the QuantStudio instrument, and there was just one Cobus instrument that was available for testing. So if you look at the results, we basically had up to 13,500 tests performed in the QuantStudio with a positivity of between 5 to 28%. And during the same time frame, there were about 8,900 tests performed on the Cobus instrument with a positivity rate of 10 to 33%. So what I wanted to highlight here is that although there was a 5% reduction in performance, because of the fact that we had, there was better access or there were more instruments available for testing using the QuantStudio, there was a 1.7-fold increase in testing volumes. So I'm highlighting here access to testing versus assay sensitivity. And then what about people taking their own swabs? So a quick literature search shows several papers with favorable outcomes for self-collected or less invasive specimen types, and these range all the way from nasal, rectal, vaginal, and oral swabs. And then in this review paper by Cockerell et al., this was a review of 13 clinical studies which investigated self-collection for various respiratory pathogens. And what this paper basically showed is that self-collection is more convenient, it is efficient, safe, and potentially cost-effective. There was also a greater than 90% agreement between the healthcare worker nasopharyngeal swab and the self-collected mid-turbinate swab. And about 88% of individuals also preferred self-collection. And then the two papers that are highlighted at the bottom was released from our group, and we basically looked at a comparison of the performance of the healthcare worker nasopharyngeal swab compared to the self-collected nasal swab for COVID testing. So what we found was that nasal swab self-sampling was acceptable, and there was comparable quality between the two swabs. With our usability studies, we also showed high usability scores for nasal swabs, both by the observers and the participants. And then basically what we found was that there was better diagnosis of SARS-CoV-2 by the healthcare worker nasopharyngeal swab, but self-collected nasal swabs was found to be an acceptable additional specimen. And then I briefly mentioned earlier the fact that we have a consortium of people. So this includes both your clinical researchers as well as your laboratory researchers who are working together collaboratively across the globe to improve the use of tongue swabs for TB diagnosis. So the information from all of our groups were shared at a symposium at the Union Conference held in Paris in November last year. And here I'm just highlighting the different topics that were presented at the symposium. And I'm going to be using some of the slides from these speakers just to emphasize some of the work that we've been doing collaboratively. So what have we done with regard to TB with regard to tongue swabs for TB? Well, we've used a whole lot of different types of swabs, such as the Copan flock swab, the SteriPax spun polyester swab, as well as other alternative sampling devices. We've also looked into what kind of collection methods are required, and should we actually be storing the swab dry or collecting it into buffer, collecting it into a dry tube? What are the optimal storage temperatures? Is the heat inactivation that is required before storage? And then for processing, we've looked at, is heat-only lysis an option? Should we be using chemical or enzymatic lysis? And we've also investigated a whole lot of different types of mechanical lysis, including bead beating, vortex beating, hand beating, and sonication. We also looked at the possibility of whether DNA extraction can be eliminated. So is it actually needed before amplification and detection? And the different types of downstream testing platforms that we've also looked at include manual qPCR, the GeneXpert Ultra, the MolBio, and then we've also investigated other moderate complexity WHO recommended technologies. So what we did find is that DNA extraction may not always be required in order to test tongue swabs on downstream under different amplification methods, and I'll speak about this a bit more. So some of the processing key takeaways that our group has come up with is that it is best to transport your swab dry in a dry tube, then elute into TE buffer once the swab actually gets to the testing facility. Some kind of inactivation is required, as is some kind of mechanical lysis before any amplification and detection takes place. And what we've shown is that with optimal collection, elution, and lysis, low bacillary loads of MTB can be detected on a tongue swab. And I mentioned before that we are working across a global network looking at the use of tongue swabs for MT diagnosis. And I just wanted to highlight some of the studies and some of the sites that are using what we call a consensus protocol. And this is done on the Expert Ultra cartridge for processing of tongue swabs. And this was no easy feat. It's taken a lot of research into trying to optimize the method. And we're not saying we're there 100% as yet, but we seem to have found a method that is able to also help us to detect low bacillary loads of TB. And then just to highlight some of the sensitivity or some of the performance data for some of these studies, depending on the downstream testing method, the sensitivity ranges from like 71% to as high as 99%, using some of the different methods that I've mentioned earlier. So another aspect that I wanted to also highlight is that we have been seeing some errors on the Expert Ultra. So some sites have been experiencing a higher than expected error rate, but this is variable by site. And greater than 80% of the error code was the 2008 error, which those that are familiar with the Expert Ultra know this is a pressure error. We suspect that is likely specific to the GeneXpert platform. So some of the sites have managed to resolve some of the error rates through module replacements, etc. But we also believe that these errors can also be addressed with a simple protocol modification to better solubilize the sample. So Prior to doing any work on the swabs in our setting in Johannesburg, we performed this study in collaboration with FINE, where we evaluated these four, what the WHO now calls moderate complexity platforms. And basically what we found is that not all technologies are equal. Each of these platforms have advantages and disadvantages. They have different processing protocols. They require different buffers. And also the time to result for each of these differs somewhat. And basically the work that came out of this group was used in part by the WHO to make the recommendations for use of these platforms for TB testing. And then the work that we did was also used by the South African Department of Health, who have now decided to include the BD as well as the Roche platforms for initial TB diagnostic testing in South Africa. So the BD platforms are currently being rolled out, and the Roche is to follow soon. So basically, we are not going to be only using the Cepheid instrument anymore. There are now options for medium throughput and high throughput labs as well. And because of the fact that we're now going to be using additional diagnostics on sputum, we've set up this study at the Hillbrow Community Health Center, where we're basically looking at a comparison of the results of a sputum compared to a tongue swab on both the Cobus MTB as well as the BD Max MDR TB assays. So to be eligible for the study, participants have to be at least 18 years old and symptomatic for TB, and they have to be willing to return for a second visit. So any participant on TB treatment 6 months prior to enrollment were not included in the study, and all participants provided written informed consent. So for the study design, at visit 1, participants provided 2 sputum specimens and 2 swabs, and these were used both for routine testing as well as for study testing. Participants were asked to return for a second visit within 7 days of visit 1, where an additional 2 sputum and 2 swabs were collected, and again, these were used for both routine as well as for study testing. We also had a month 2 follow-up visit just to check on the well-being of these participants. So for this study, we used a Copan flock swab with either a 30 or an 80 millimeter breakpoint. And just some additional factors to keep into consideration: tongue swab collection was randomized. Tongue swabs were collected before or after sputum. All specimens were transported at 2 to 8 degrees to the testing laboratory. And participants were provided with a tongue swab to perform self-collection on the morning of visit 2. So basically, when they return to the clinic for visit 2, they already had a self-collected swab with them. And then just to speak a little bit about the way that the sputum is processed in the lab before I move on to swabs. So processing on the Gene Expert and the BD Max platforms are very similar, where you just add an inactivation buffer, you incubate at room temperature, and you then test this inactivated specimen on the respective instruments. So testing on the Cobus assays are slightly more complicated because you also have a sonication and centrifugation step after inactivation of the specimen and prior to loading onto the Cobus instruments for processing. So for the swabs on BD Max, swabs were collected either dry or collected into buffer. So for the dry swab, we basically had 3 moles of STR buffer added at the lab. This was incubated, and 2.5 moles was added onto the BD Max for processing. And then the swab that was transported in TE buffer, it was the same processing except for the fact that we now added 2 moles of STR buffer before, and then added the same 2.5 moles to the BD Max for processing. And the sputum method I went through on our previous slides. I'm not going to go through it here. So basically, results on the BD Max assay is available in about 3.6 hours, and you get an MTB detection result as well as a different INH resistance profile at the same time. On the Cobus assay, we had both swabs that were transported dry. Here we added 1.8 moles of the manufacturer-provided buffer. We then had an incubation time and then a sonication before loading onto this Cobus 6800. So here we didn't perform a centrifugation step, and this protocol was discussed with the manufacturer before implementation. And then I've already gone through the sputum processing flow. So on this assay, results are available in about 8 hours, and the initial assay gives you a MTB detection result only. And if you want a RIF and INH resistance profile, then this needs to be performed in a reflex format. And then for the ultra processing, we didn't use the SR buffer, but we decided to use a phosphate buffer because of the fact that the SR buffer is quite a harsh buffer. So here we had a dry tongue swab placed in a tube to which 2.2 moles of phosphate buffer was added. We then vortex followed by a 5-minute incubation, and we transferred 2 moles of the cartridge before testing on the Gene Expert platform. And then for results, so at the end of the study, we had enrolled 322 participants with a mean age of 40 years old. 63% of participants were male, 57% were HIV positive, 3 had an unknown status. And then there were 13% who were smear positive and 13% who had a previously diagnosed TB episode. So if you compare the performance of the swab to sputum for each of the assays, what we see is that there is more MTB detection in your sputum compared to your swabs. There was also a higher rate of MTB detection on a swab transported in TE buffer as compared to the swab transported dry, and this was tested on the BD Max assay. And we also saw that there was little difference in the swab performance on the Cobus assay before or after sputum collection. And then if we further stratify the results by the semi-quantitative result of the sputum ultra, on those participants who had a high or medium bacillary load, we see that the detection on both assays using the swab was quite good, but it becomes more variable as the bacillary load decreases. So there is some detection, but like I mentioned, there is some variability. And then in terms of unsuccessful results, we had about a 12% unsuccessful result using a swab on the ultra. And I went through this a little bit earlier. We had a 3.1% or up to an 8.5% error rate on the BD Max assay, and there were no unsuccessful results using the Cobus MTB. And then I briefly mentioned tongue swab, or I mentioned self-collection using other specimen types earlier. So for the tongue swab collection for TB specifically, we've had 2 studies that we've performed. The first one was a supervised self-collection. So here the participant was given a printed instruction when they got to the clinic or to the healthcare facilities. They were asked to follow these instructions and perform a self-collection. And what we found were that participants were able to follow the instructions without any intervention. There was a request for instructions to be translated to languages other than English, and 2 users suggested a video instead of printed instructions. And then the second study that we did was an unsupervised self-collection. So this was a study that I mentioned earlier where participants were asked to perform at-home collection. So because of the fact that participants had already been exposed to healthcare worker collection at their first visit, they found the process a little bit easier. They also reported that the swab was an easier specimen type to transport as compared to a sputum, and they liked the fact that they were able to collect the specimen in the privacy of their own home. So if we compare the performance of the healthcare worker collected swab to the self-collected swab, we see that there's very good agreement for MTB detection between the 2 swabs. And then from a healthcare worker perspective, healthcare workers prefer tongue self-collection for safety reasons. They also reported that it is an easier and quicker specimen type to collect. It's also easier to package for transport, and there was no need to check the specimen quality and quantity, which is normally required for sputum. So what specimen type do individuals prefer for detection? So here I report on results from the sites that I mentioned earlier. This is the R2D2 ADAPT sites, where there were 650 participants enrolled, and our Hillbrow study where we had about 300 and we had just about 330 participants enrolled. So how did participants feel about the swab overall? So the majority reported that they did not experience any discomfort. They felt that the tongue swab collection was shorter compared to the sputum. Specimen collection was also easier for the tongue swab. So the one difference between the two studies was that for the Hillbrow study, participants didn't seem to mind whether the tongue swab was self-collected or healthcare worker collected. But on the other studies, basically the participants preferred that the healthcare worker collect the swab. So overall, participants were satisfied or happy, very happy about their experience with the swab collection, and they felt that it was very easy to do. And in some of these studies also had urine collected for testing on other assays. So participants were asked to note which specimen type they preferred, and you can see here that the tongue swab was the clear winner between all or amongst all studies. So swab testing on existing molecular platforms is ongoing, like I've mentioned, and I've spoken a little bit about the different assays that we've been working on to optimize protocols for tongue swab testing. That's shown in the diagram on your left. And the diagram on your right shows some new technologies, and all of these are point of care technologies that are being designed specifically for swabs. So these manufacturers have already taken into consideration any pre-processing protocols to address safety and performance of these assays. And these also afford us the opportunity for near patient testing, which is one of the transitions that I mentioned in the first slide of my talk. And a lot of these assays or a lot of these instruments also allow for testing of other diseases, which allows for multiplex testing, which is also one of the transitions that they mentioned. So I think we're moving in the right direction to close the gaps for TB diagnosis. And then I also wanted to mention what we call ultra high throughput technology. So this is called a Nexa system. This was used for COVID, originally used in the agricultural industry, but then transitioned to COVID during the pandemic. So this allows for testing of thousands of specimens in a day, and it uses a swab as a specimen type for testing. So we're now also trying to optimize the protocol for MTB detection on this platform, and this is in progress at the moment. So like I said, we work with evaluations of technologies all the way from point of care to ultra high throughput. And then just in summary, so tongue swabs have a role in improving the pathology value chain. Tongue swabs are an acceptable additional specimen type for TB testing. However, we do know that they possess less bacilli and TB DNA, therefore sensitivity will be reduced as compared to sputum. I've also shown that national programs are amenable to additional specimen types for diagnosis. And we have had several good lessons that we learned through our COVID-19 testing experiences, such as the access versus assay sensitivity, which can be applied to TB testing. The use of tongue swabs, they also have several desirable attributes, which are similar to nasal swabs for COVID, that potentially offset any reductions in sensitivity in favor of increased access to testing. So we've also shown that tongue swab collection is simple, self-collection is possible. It has simple processing because we've seen that DNA extraction is not always required. Tongue swabs are acceptable by healthcare workers, patients, and laboratorians. They are also easier, quicker to collect. They are less safety concerns. They're easier to transport. And we've shown by using different types of swabs across the various studies that there are multiple swab materials and brands that may be used. They are also shown to be highly stable with dry transport and storage possible. And just a simple elution method may be used to remove the specimen from the swab. However, optimal sensitivity requires mechanical treatment. So we've also shown compatibility with existing WHO recommended diagnostics, although some optimization is still in progress. And swabs also have the capability of enabling community-based testing, including new platforms that have low cost and short processing times. And then I would just like to thank the many individuals, the many groups that are involved in all of these studies. And as you can see, it's quite a huge consortium with many different partners. And I'd just like to say thank you again for giving me this opportunity to present.
Thank you so much, Anura, for that informative presentation. I just would like to tell the people in attendance that if they have any comments or questions, please do enter them under the Q&A tab. Additionally, please be reminded that if you'd like to see yourself on this platform, do send through an email to myself at nkosi@tbthinktank.org.
I don't see any questions on the Q&A. If there are any questions, probably the participants can post their questions on that part so that we can pick them up, and Anura is here to respond to any questions.
Perhaps, Anura, do you have any almost concluding remarks, perhaps while people think of comments or questions?
Sure, Nalwazi. So yeah, it's actually very exciting for us. We've been doing this oral swab work for quite a number of years right now, and I think it's also very exciting that people are prepared to collaborate. So we're trying to not duplicate efforts. People are learning from each other, and I think that's one of the reasons that we're actually getting as far as we are. We obviously don't have all of the answers yet. There's still optimization that is required on the different technologies, but it's also very heartening to see that, especially from the manufacturer's point of view, they have heard what we've been saying. We have presented preliminary results on many other platforms, and basically the manufacturers are coming on board and also working with us to produce technologies that can work on swabs specifically. So it's a very exciting space to be in, and and I just love the fact that we're getting quite far along with looking at swabs for TB.
Thank you, Anura. We have a question that asks, maybe can you talk a bit to how you see where the swabs are going for now and what the timeline could be for seeing it in the field?
So yeah, that's a difficult one. Thank you, Salome. I see it's from Salome. So yeah, so like I said, we've made a lot of progress, right? We had to do a lot of trial and error. We started off, like some of the earlier studies that we did, we realized that we didn't actually process the swabs that we could, the way that we should have. So that's why the evidence that's available right now, like for other studies that I mentioned, is not always the most reliable or cannot conclusively tell us what we need to know about swabs. But I think we're working and getting the right direction. And I think there's we need to do a lot more testing, a lot more optimization in order to get there. Timelines, I think, is a little bit difficult to speak about right now. But yeah, hopefully we can get there quite soon.
Thank you, Anura. We have a question here as well. It seems a bit incomplete, but I would assume that they're asking about cost implications, if there are any.
Okay, sure. So I think for some of the current assays, the cost of testing a swab would be about the same as that for a sputum, because of the fact that you're using exactly the same assay, exactly the same processing methods. But what I know that with the new point of care technology that I mentioned, we are trying to cut down costs, because now these assays are going to be designed specifically for swabs. And then the ultra high throughput testing method that I mentioned, because of the fact that we're going to be testing such high volumes once we get it up and running, this will also cause a reduction in costs of testing using that platform. So good news is that we may be able to reduce costs depending on the type of platform that you're going to be doing testing on.
Thank you. We have one here that starts with a comment that says great work, and they ask if it will work for children with lower bug loads.
So most of the consortium has been focusing on work on adults. I know there have been some other groups that are working on using tongue swabs for peds, and they have shown some favorable results. I think we're still a little bit, early in that, but I mean, the work is definitely being done to ensure that, it can be used across peds and adults.
Okay, that is good to know. Just checking if we have any new questions. Colleagues, please do submit your questions, comments. I think we'll give them perhaps another 3 to 5 minutes. Togo, do you perhaps have any comments or questions?
Not questions, but just to express our gratitude to Anura for this session. Thank you so much for taking your time, and all the attendees that are here. But I see there's one more question. I was about to say if there are no further questions, perhaps we can end it here. But there's one question, perhaps we can take it.
Thank you. This is a question, Anura, that asks, is this a self-test? If so, will the specimen be processed at the lab?
Okay, so I think like we did with COVID, we had a lot of questions around self-testing and how these results were going, or who was going to do the testing and how we were going to get the results back. So so currently in our studies, we've had the participants perform self-collection but drop the tests off and they were transported to the lab for testing. But I think that once we have more point of care tests available, it is going to be possible to do this testing closer to the patient. So we're hoping that that's going to be the way to go eventually, especially if we want to find the missing millions and increase the number of tests that we are doing, increase or reach more community, reach more people in the community. I think that's the route that we're going to have to go. So yeah, we're going to have to see where this takes us, but I think that's the ultimate goal, right? To get closer to the patient.
That's good to hear. Thank you. I think I'll give colleagues about 2 minutes, and then if not, we will close the session at 12:40. And if somehow we close the session and you have any questions that come up, you are still able to email myself at ngosi@tbthinktank.org, as well as my colleague Mdube at tbthinktank.org, and then we'll ensure that Anura responds to your question. We have one as well, Anura. It says, thank you so much for the presentation. It's very informative. So this person missed the beginning. I think they just need clarity in terms of which consortium is being represented, rather.
Okay, so this is a consortium that was put together by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we're basically grantees of the foundation, and we're basically just working together to ensure that we're optimizing the protocols to the best of our ability.
Thank you. So we're just giving people 1 more minute before we end the session for any questions or comments.
There's a comment from Prof. Njeka. It
Yes.
says, good presentation and thanks a lot. Looking forward to more data. And then the question, I think it says, I see diversification of tests with high throughput, etc. Any plan to use old GeneXpect equipment that will be removed?
That's the interesting question for me. Unfortunately, I'm not the one that makes that decision, right? But yeah, we are showing good results using the Ultra, right? So I don't, if we can get a protocol optimized and get to and this helps us to increase the access to testing, then I think that's definitely something that we should consider looking at.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's all from my side.
Okay, thank you, Mtobo. And again, thank you, Nura, for your time and for your presentation. Thanks to everyone in attendance, and please enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week. Thank you and see you next month.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.